And now, our speaker for the morning. All of us know Paul Blaney, but I want to welcome Dr. Paul Blaney for taking time to speak to us. Some of you may know Paul is a recently retired dean from Emory and Henry College, and prior to that, he was at the University of Texas in Austin and the University of Miami. Paul is also a musician, and it is through that I've delighted in his COA course on Bach. I learned wonderful things about Bach, heard more Bach music than I'd heard in my life, and heard wonderful musicians. Paul has played for us, as well as he was the organist for St. John's Lutheran Church for a number of years. Paul, we welcome you. Thanks for sharing with us. And I turn this over to you, and the title is Symbols. Thanks, Paul. And if you've unmuted. Okay.
Can you hear me?
You're good.
You've seen the bumper stickers on which is written, I kneel for the cross and stand for the flag. My personal response when I see that sticker is to say, in the immortal words of Jerry Seinfeld, there's nothing wrong with that. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Still, the sticker merits a bit of examination. Somehow we know that someone who puts that slogan on their car bumper is not just describing what they do, they're saying that this is what everyone should do. They're saying it with feeling and with a bit of self-righteousness, just maybe. So as I say, it definitely merits a bit of examination. First off, the flag and the cross are symbols. They're logos, branding devices, if you will. The intersecting pieces of wood and the patches of red, white, and blue fabric are unimportant apart from the meanings and associations that they evoke. The same goes for standing and kneeling, also saluting, bowing, putting your hand on your heart, and so on. All are expressions of respect, symbolic expressions, and as such, they are distillations, simplifications. Indeed, symbols are usually oversimplifications, which means that they can provide a wonderful, wonderful foundation for simplistic, oversimplified thinking. Symbols are usually presented in a way that has an aesthetic overlay as well. So religion often involves symbolism of elegant music, imposing architecture, and eloquent prayers. If the choir sounds so good and the building is so imposing and the preacher is so eloquent, then obviously God must be on board, right? And religious and patriotic symbols are often tied to historical incidents, myths, what have you, which typically aim to tell us how wonderful we are to be members of a group with such an impressive backstory. Reality is, of course, often more complicated. Some of the symbols for which we kneel or stand or clap or cheer are reminders of glorious histories, except that if we look more closely, these glorious histories are actually rather shameful. When I think of shameful symbols, what pops into your, when I say shameful symbols, what pops into your mind? For me, and maybe for you as well, it's statues of Confederate generals. The message to any generation should be careful what monuments you build, as history will be watching. When I went to college, my school's athletic teams were the Crusaders. Interesting symbol. But after 9/11, guess what? The college decided that the teams were instead the Lions instead. Good move. Symbols can involve behavioral enactments as well. In religious contexts, we call them rituals, but there are secular rituals as well, such as reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Sometimes the rituals are complex, like liturgies or parades. They promote a particular orthodoxy using the power of repetition, often through the power of familiarity. However, there is reason to believe that if repeated too frequently, they become overly familiar and they gradually lose whatever power they might once have had. People sleepwalk through them. I bet that for most of us, the Pledge of Allegiance means more to us today, on the rare occasions when we are called upon to recite it, than it meant to us when we were doing it day after day, after day after day, when we were school children. Interestingly, Jesus addressed this very issue when he told his disciples not to use vain repetitions when praying. He offered what we know as the Lord's Prayer as an alternative, but unfortunately, he did not specify the frequency with which it could be recited. But most symbols are much more mundane than crosses or liturgies or flags and pledges. We are intelligent beings whose lives are carried out in symbols, most obviously words. A book is a real thing, but the word book is just a symbol. I'm a real person, but Paul is just a symbol. Remember the childhood's chant, sticks and stones can break my bones, but names will never hurt me. The thing is, even when we recited it, we knew it was not 100% true. It was aspirational. Being mocked and insulted can have an impact. In fact, over the past several years, a politician who will remain unnamed, who has great name calling skills, and we saw him use those skills to intimidate and consolidate power. Religions certainly attach importance to names. What is the central tenet of Islam? Quote, there is one God and Allah is his name. And within evangelical culture, the culture in which I grew up, the most common way to end any prayer was, in Jesus' name, amen. Sure, names are just symbols, but they do matter. Our economy is also based on symbols. I have some pieces of paper in my wallet whose value is only symbolic. As I said, good symbols also have a little artistic appeal. And in this case, there are pictures of famous Americans on those pieces of paper to help them seem authentic. Still, they will not feed me or keep me warm. If I were to take a whole bunch of them and stitch them together, I guess I could wear them. And they would keep me a little bit warm. But if they were all $50 bills, they wouldn't keep me any more warmer than if they were $1 bills, or for that matter, counterfeit. The point is, they seem authentic. Their value is a fiction, but it's okay as long as we all share the same fiction. Other economically important symbols are logos and trademarks, etc. It's all a matter of branding. I'm told that Harvard University spends millions of dollars each year to protect the name Harvard from being used by other organizations, and there are good reasons for it to do so. I just wish that God would spend some money on lawyers whose job it would be to keep all kinds of people from doing all kinds of things under his name. Which brings us back to the role of symbols in religion. Some religions are more symbol-based than others. As you may know, Freud's theory viewed the mind as working in symbols. For instance, psychoanalysis gets deep into the psyche by dream interpretation, which of course involves the assumption that dreams represent the patient's concerns symbolically. It's no coincidence that Freud was Jewish, and the version of Judaism that he knew was also particularly infused with a focus on symbols. But more broadly, there is one thing that all religions use symbols to strive for, and that is authenticity. But what the proof of authenticity is varies greatly from one to another. I first gave this matter some thought when I was a college freshman. I happened to cop a job as a church organist. It was at a small Episcopal church. It turned out to be a high church. Scriptures and prayers were chanted, bells tinkled, incense burned. It was all quite a shock for an innocent evangelical boy like me, coming from a church in which spontaneity and informality were the marks of authenticity. My first reaction was to dismiss the Episcopalians as just going through the motions, sleepwalking, whatever. But the more I thought about it, the less clear the contrast between the two kinds of worship services became. Sure, when praying, the pastor of my own church usually did not read from a service book like the Episcopalians did, no, in fact, my pastor prayed from the heart. But then when I thought about it, I realized how incredibly redundant and formulaic those spontaneous prayers at my own church were. Sure, they differed from week to week, but they drew upon a rather short list of catchphrases, and yes, keywords were conveyed more emotionally at my evangelical church. But such voice patterns were in fact prescribed by the worship traditions of the denomination. Even the way words were pronounced could differ slightly. While the accent at the Episcopal Church was often a bit British, the accent in my evangelical church in New England, mind you, was slightly Nashville. Either accent can seem authentic to some persons and phony to others. Similarly, even within just the tradition, the Christian tradition, for some persons, attending Mass at the Vatican would be the ultimate experience, while for others, the only real religious experience is one that is reached by walking down the sawdust trail. When it comes to art and music preferences, we say there's no accounting for taste. Well, there's no accounting for taste when it comes to religion either, and religious fads can be just as fickle as anything else. The matter of religious symbols mattered in my family. Both of my parents had evangelical roots, but different evangelical roots. My father had grown up a Baptist in Canada. My mother, a birthright Quaker, a member of the Ohio Yearly Meeting of the Society of Friends. She was born into it. Quakers, at least traditionally, do not have liturgies, no communion services, no baptism. It bothered my dad that his wife was not baptized till about 15 years into their marriage. When I was about 3, my mom consented to be baptized. Though, as the story is told, she never took it as seriously as my dad did, and this was something that irritated him. The Quakers just weren't into the symbols, or were they? A couple of generations before she came along, the women in my mom's family would have been women who wore Quaker bonnets. She didn't, but she didn't wear any jewelry either, other than her very simple wedding band. And she wore essentially no makeup. I bet that she never owned a lipstick tube. When she died, the funeral people did the usual makeup job on her face. And when I saw it, I had to tell them, take it off, take it off, take it off. Her lifelong rejection of adornment was a symbol of her Christian piety. No point giving it up just because she died. Okay, she could give her life up, but I wasn't going to let that mean that she had to give up her symbolic simplicity as well. And they, in fact, did take it off before anyone else in the family saw it, thank goodness. Communion is, of course, the most pervasive Christian symbol. As you may know, as was mentioned, I was recently the organist at the Lutheran Church in Abington, where every Sunday morning, the service is a communion service. Did I take communion on a weekly basis there? You bet I did. And I did so understanding that it likely symbolized something different for others than it did for me. But the bottom line was that by not taking it, I would have been symbolically setting myself apart from the communal experience, and I did not want to do that. There's actually a UU church in Boston whose website has the following statement. Quote, "We celebrate communion the first Sunday of the month and every Wednesday evening. We hold a diversity of beliefs regarding the meaning of Holy Communion. But one thing, say one thing is certain. We welcome all to participate. And we can infer that one thing is the only thing that is certain in a UU church, just about. Contrast that with the Catholic tradition, which leaves no room for such diversity. Instead, there is a doctrine of transubstantiation through which there is a miraculous change by which the Eucharistic elements at their consecration become the body and blood of Christ while keeping only the appearance of bread and wine. So, wow, these communion elements are both symbolic and real. Well, for sure, some things are both symbolic and real. In the late spring, Weva learned of a family in quarantine without food, so she took some groceries to them. It was a blessing box on wheels, I guess. Those groceries were real, but they were symbolic as well. Sometimes this symbolic real thing can get complicated, though. Take sex, for instance. Sex is for sure real. I'm talking about, say, sexual intercourse. But sex can also be a powerful symbol, and what exactly is symbolized may be unclear. Within a couple, one person may see a particular sexual encounter as having no special meaning at all, while the other takes it as till death do us part. And getting back to religious symbols, even people who agree on the technical meaning of a ritual may experience it very differently. One person may be caught up in the emotional content of the words. Another is participating because it's a hoop he's been told to jump through, while another person might relate to its poetic beauty, and on and on and on. You can't talk for long about the distinction between what is symbolic and what is real without running into the notion of superstition, or to use a more contemporary phrase, magical thinking. Among rational people in a society like ours, we tend to be quiet about our little superstitions, but of course, for some people, symbols and rituals have real mystical power, as one believes that one could not possibly get COVID in church because of the symbolic power of the church. Symbols, if taken too seriously, can get you in trouble, particularly when you engage in a symbolic act instead of doing something practical. In fact, people sometimes use rituals as a lazy substitute for more arduous but productive endeavors. Another word about bumper stickers. I've never had reason to view the Abingdon police as anything but benevolent, but the fact that they have the words "In God We Trust" on their bumpers does nothing to give me confidence in their fairness and goodwill. It's too easy for such a symbolic statement to be a substitute for professionalism rather than an evidence of it. Another interesting category of physical items that are both real and symbolic is clothes. I've recently read the book Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, which I recommend. It describes clothing rules that are often employed to make sure everyone knows who is above whom in a society that has castes. Does anybody know the word sumptuary laws? A quick glance at Wikipedia suggests that they started in England in the 14th century when a sumptuary statute was enacted involving, quote, restrictions on clothing based on social class. The earliest example of class-based restriction was that of fur, prohibited for anyone below the rank of lady or knight. The goal would have been intended to make sure that commoners who did not get wealthy commoners who did get wealthy enough to afford such attire would not be able to pass themselves off. Clothes kept you warm, but they also affirmed the precedence of one group over another. What about America today? Well, no, we don't have sumptuary laws, but it is illegal to impersonate a police officer by wearing a uniform or showing a badge or by driving with red and blue lights flashing from your car. There are parallel issues in the military, which of course has different uniforms for different ranks and with decorations marking past service and rank, all of them symbols that are not to be messed with. And indeed, there are laws against stolen valor, false claims of military achievement. Back to clothing. It's not just the military and the police that wear symbolic attire. It's seen in medical contexts as well. When I was about 23 years of age and a second-year graduate student in clinical psychology in Minnesota, I had my first clinical placement in the VA Medical Center, Twin Cities VA Hospital. On my first day, I was given a white coat, and it was interesting to see what happened when I wore it. Pregnant women who were 10 or 15 years older than I was would hold the door open for me. A patient was telling me about his struggles with his teenage daughter, and he asked me, "Doc, do you have any teenagers yourself?" I was 23, and I probably looked even younger than that when I wasn't wearing my white coat. One interesting thing about attire is that there's research indicating that how you are clothed affects not only how others see you, but how you see yourself. In one well-known study, undergraduates were given white coats to wear, but some were told that they were wearing a doctor's coat. The others were told it was a painter's coat. Then they were given a cognitive task, one that was not difficult, but which people regularly made mistakes on if they were not being super careful. Guess what? The students wearing the doctor's coat made many fewer errors based solely on the symbolic aura of what they were wearing. In this vein, actors reported that getting into the character's clothing, the wardrobe for the character, helps them get into the character. So what other persons wear distinctive garb these days? Academics do, but only during commencement, so that doesn't really count. Judges do. It's one way to tell the judge from anyone else in the courtroom, so it serves an important function. Clergy do, not all clergy, not all circumstances, but it's a common thing. In all cases, whether it's police or clergy or anywhere between, the message is the person who's wearing this outfit is trained, credentialed, set apart. This is somebody who adheres to a code of behavior, can be trusted, can be deferred to as appropriate. And indeed, if I were stuck at 2 o'clock in the morning at the side of the road needing help and somebody pulled up behind me in an unmarked car, I'd be relieved if someone who got out of that car was wearing a police uniform. I would experience trust. But that coin has another side, does it not? As anyone active in the defund the police movement would gladly explain to us. I don't think I need to be more explicit. And if you haven't seen the movie Spotlight, you really should. It's about how the pedophile behavior of priests in Boston were covered up for many years and about how difficult it was to blow their cover. After all, the righteousness of anyone wearing clerical garb can be taken for granted, right? My point is that when ill will and abuse wear the figurative and literal clothing that signifies goodwill and safety, that betrayal is all the more vile. In that vein, it's sad that historically clergy and police and soldiers who behave monstrously are all too likely to get away with it, even when they're caught red-handed. Don't get me started on that. As an aside, You may recall that Jesus spoke harshly about the scribes and Pharisees, and when he did so, he focused on the way they flaunted their status by the garments they wore, extra long tassels, whatever. And also, when it comes to uniforms, there's concern that some people who are drawn to roles that involve uniforms because it fits their fantasies of personal power and status, and they take themselves way too seriously when wearing them. You know, it's the idea that sometimes the people who are attracted to police jobs are exactly the people you would least want to attract to police jobs. Is anybody really surprised that veterans and police officers were well represented among the January 6th rioters in the Capitol? I don't think so. Back to symbols. There is a key aspect to them which we have not mentioned, namely that they are usually unintrusive, inert, passive, non-interactive. You may recall the instance in the mid-90s, it was all over the national news, in which a woman in Florida perceived an image of the Virgin Mary on her cheese toast. Talk about symbols, wow. I recall a pastor talking about it at the time, and his comment was an interesting one. It was, and I quote, "The thing about the Virgin Mary on a piece of toast is that she never talks back to you." I'll read it again. "The thing about the Virgin Mary on a piece of toast is that she never talks back to you." No matter how much you revere that piece of toast or whatever, it will not point out your failures to seek justice, embrace mercy, or walk humbly. Maybe seeing that toast will remind you to do the right thing, but that's not worth much if your notions regarding right and wrong were screwed up to begin with. The toast will not argue with you about your moral priorities. Symbols are no good at confronting you about your blind spots. In fact, they are every bit as likely to supercharge your prejudices as they are to challenge them. This includes the American flag, which also does not talk back. It means different things to different people, something we were reminded of acutely when we saw flags amidst the Capitol riot on January 6th. Then 2 weeks later, we saw flags, American flags, providing the backdrop for the inauguration at that same Capitol. But to look at the matter of flags more closely, I'd like to turn to, I'd like to take you back 20 years and to look at a time when patriotic fervor ran very high in the weeks after September 11th, 2001. Many of you remember it vividly. Very few people were questioning anything patriotic seeming at that point. One person who had the courage to do so was Barbara Kingsolver. 2 weeks after 9/11, she published an op-ed piece in the San Francisco Chronicle entitled, "And Our Flag Was Still There." It's easy to find that essay online. Just Google flag and Kingsolver and it will pop up. It begins with an account of her daughter coming home from kindergarten and announcing that all the kids in her class were expected to wear red, white, and blue to school the next day. That daughter, of course, being Lily, who not long ago was central to the religious education program in our church. In Barbara's essay, she listed the many horrific activities and asked this question. In other words, made this statement, I should say. In other words, it is a question. That's the point of it. But anyway, here it is. In other words, the American flag stands for intimidation, censorship, violation, bigotry, sexism, homophobia, and shoving the Constitution through the paper shredder. Notice I did raise my voice at the end because there's a question mark there, but unfortunately when the essay was reprinted in other papers, starting with the Wall Street Journal, much of the time, the question mark went missing. Many persons who knew of Barbara's essay knew it only from this one sentence without context in without question mark. Now, the sentence was provocative enough even with the question mark, and far more so without it. But what was her point? Later in the essay, she declared that her mission was, quote, to recapture my flag from the men now waving it in the name of jingoism and censorship. And later, I quote, I would like to stand up for my flag and wave it over a few things I believe in, including but not limited to the protection of dissenting points of view. Now you get the gist, and I really hope you do read the essay again if you've read it before. Again, just Google flag and Kingsolver. It's easy to get to pop up. It's a great reminder of how easily symbols, powerful symbols, can be co-opted and turned upside down. I want to move to the close of this essay, this talk, by sharing something that I first heard from the Lutheran pastor Jim Bangle, whom some of you know, a line he had gotten from yet another pastor. We were somehow talking about symbols, and he uttered this statement, which was in effect the seed for this talk this morning. So I'll quote it. Never get into a fight over a symbol, because if you win, it's a symbolic victory. Never get into a fight over a symbol, because if you win, it's just a symbolic victory. I share this quote not because I'm sure I agree with it 100%. I agree with it sort of in the way I agree with the statement, sticks and stones can break my bones, but names can never hurt me. But I share it because I think it's definitely food for thought and puts the whole issue of symbols into perspective. So it brings us back, I guess, to this service at our church. And regarding that, I'll say when it comes to religious symbols, I'm happy with a gong, a candle, a stone, some water, some warm, unpretentious words that are spoken when we engage with the candle, the stone, and the water. Thanks.